woke up on the wrong side of the bed one morning to what sounded like raccoons digging through my trash can. I armed myself with a broomstick and ran outside in my pajamas, but when I got there, whatever it was had already run off. They left my trash can knocked over, with all the bags split open, and there was trash strewn all over the place. That certainly didn't put me in a good mood, but I had to pick it up as quickly as I could. I had a double shift at work that day, noon to close. Had to get a shower and everything too, because a Hooters girl doesn't earn tips if she smells like trash. My whole day at work was awful. We had more creeps in the restaurant than usual, which is saying something. Many hungry eyes were waiting for me. The nastiest creeps too, relentless and persistent, and most were too broke to tip me more than a few quarters. But the worst part was, Carl, the fry cook who was working the same shift as me, stared at me more than any customer, with these sad, pathetic eyes. I couldn't even catch a break in the kitchen. Carl was one of the most obese men I've ever seen. His gut was so large he struggled to reach past it to flip the patties on the griddle. He never seemed to clean his work clothes either, because there wasn't a spot left on his apron that didn't have a week's-old grease stain on it. You'd expect a guy like him to smack 3 orders of food on his lunch breaks, but he never had the time to eat at work. He was always frantically writing in his worn-out notebook during his breaks, glancing up at me whenever I was around like he knew I was going to pass by. He never stopped scribbling until it was time for him to go back to grilling. Slowly but surely the hours passed, and the restaurant finally closed for the night. All that was left was to clean up and lock up before leaving. Pretty soon, Carl and I were the only ones left. I thoroughly mopped the restaurant floor to avoid him as he cleaned the kitchen. The last place left was the men's bathroom. I always save it for last. It's kind of a vile place. I took a deep breath before entering the stench within and started mopping underneath the urinals.
I swear they intentionally piss on the floor.
Just to add on to the terrible day I was having, I started hearing suspicious noises again, rustling from the handicap stall, like someone was scraping their feet on the floor. I shoved the mop into the bucket and yelled impatiently,
"Is someone still in here? We're closed."
No answer. I walked up to the handicap stall and tried to look inside, but the door was locked.
"Whoever's in there, you have to leave. We're closed for the night."
I started banging on the door, letting out all the frustrations of the day. I gave up not very long after. I was getting tired of this. Then, I heard footsteps from the other side and saw a pair of muddy shoes beneath the door. I jolted back right as the door flew open, revealing a man who looked like he'd lived in a swamp his whole life and had starved for most of it. I recognized him as a customer from earlier in the day.
"It's nice to see you're in such a rush to see me again, baby doll, but you don't have to worry. We're alone now. We've got lots of time."
I grabbed the mop for a lack of a better weapon of defense, waving the dripping mess of tangled, filth-soaked cloth in his face.
"Forget all that! We're closed! Get out of here!"
"That's not gonna stop me, sweetheart."
He grabbed the head of the mop and yanked it out of my hands in a flash.
"I'm not leaving here without you by my side. Why don't you come over to my place for the night?"
"Beat it, creep!"
"Oh, you've got attitude, don't you? Don't worry, I'll take care of that."
I made a break for the door, but he lunged at me and grabbed my arm. I screamed.
"Carl!"
We struggled for a moment before the fry cook finally burst into the bathroom. I'd never been so glad to see him in my life. Carl took the creep by the shoulders and ripped him away from me like a rag doll. Carl slammed the creep against the wall and pinned him up. "What's going on here?"
"He's a creep, Carl! Throw him out already!"
"It's just a misunderstanding, sir."
Carl stared him down for an uncomfortable length of time. Then he whispered something in the creep's ear that I couldn't make out. The creep nodded readily. Then Carl set him down. Immediately, it seemed like all the tension had been diffused. The creep smiled non-offensively, then calmly walked out and left the store.
How did you do that without roughing him up?
Carl grinned from ear to ear like a big goof. I just told him what would happen.
Well, thank you very much, Carl. I appreciate it.
You're always welcome, Selena. I picked up the mop again, wanting to just finish closing so I could finally go home. But Carl lingered. Hey, since I saved you and all, do you think you'd like to go out on a date with me?
Not the time, Carl. Not the time.
That's okay. I'll find a good time. Then, he left, thankfully, and I got back to mopping. When I finally got home that night, I was utterly exhausted. I was seriously thinking of quitting Hooters. The meager tips didn't make up for all the interactions with sickos and freaks, and they were starting to make me paranoid. I changed back into my pajamas, made some hot chocolate, and got comfortable on the couch to binge watch my favorite show, all in an effort to just calm down and unwind from the events of the day. Too bad I didn't have any roommates I could vent to. It wasn't long before my moment of peace was ruined. I heard something rummaging through my trash can again. I didn't bother getting anything to chase them off this time. I figured my screams of rage would be enough to scare anything away. But when I opened my door, it wasn't a raccoon. It was the same creep from before, holding my trash can over his head and dumping everything onto the ground. When he saw me, he threw the empty can at me. I stumbled back through the doorway in a daze.
What the?
I told you, didn't I? You should have gone home with me, and none of this would have happened.
He stepped into my home undaunted. He laughed maniacally and inched his way closer to me. My mind raced. What should I do? Should I get a knife? Should I scream? I tripped and fell to the ground, crawling backwards towards the kitchen where I could maybe get a proper weapon to defend myself. But then, another silhouette appeared behind the creep, swallowing him in the shadows, then socked him in the back of the skull. The creep clambered forward and looked back in shock.
Why'd you... This wasn't part of the deal!
I then realized who it was. It was Carl. He approached the creep without a word and grabbed him by the neck. Carl relentlessly pummeled the creep with his fists. There was no contest. Carl was a super heavyweight in a no-holds-barred cage match with a featherweight stickman. I watched in absolute shock as Carl let loose until the creep was totally limp. Carl then finally let him go, and just by the sound of the body made as it collided with the floor, I knew that Carl had beaten him to death. Carl then turned to me, his face half lit by the streetlight shining through the wide-open door. Will you go on a date with me now?
What? No! Carl! What have you done?
I climbed to my feet, ready to outrun him if I needed to. What have I done? Really, I saved you twice. Is that not good enough for you? I know everything about you. What do you know about me? He said this while grabbing his notebook out from his pocket. He darted it to me while waiting for a response. I didn't take my eyes off Carl when I reached down slowly for the notebook. Suddenly, I realized why he was always writing in it. He was writing about me. He recorded my every movement, my habits, everyone I talked to. Did he really tell that guy to show up just so he could act like my knight? You better understand. I'm not leaving here without you by my side.
Never in 1,000 years did I ever expect to experience such a disturbing encounter during a date. A date that I'm now reminded of every time I stare at my reflection. The scars that remain on my face only reflect my scars from the outside, but don't project the scars from the inside. The brutality in the hands of this certain individual left me seeking professional counseling. I find it difficult to erase the image of the individual's face from my memory, as it still sends shockwaves through my anatomy. Maybe sharing my story with the world will help close this horrific chapter of my life. It all started a couple years ago, when the dating app Tinder first launched. I remember seeing all of my friends download the app as it was the new trend when it came to online dating. I've used other dating apps in the past, but never really got too far in the dating scene besides a nice meeting you text or a $100 bill after a lunch date. There was this one occasion when I got home from a long day of school. I remember face planting on my bed the moment I stepped foot inside my room. I had just finished midterms and felt the sudden urge to blow off some steam and perhaps go out later that night. I grabbed my cell phone and began messaging my friends in our group chat saying, "Yo, anyone down to chill later?" A couple of minutes go by and I get a few replies saying something to the effect of, "Not today with girlfriend," or "Got a Tinder date tonight." This was incredibly frustrating, as I felt like I was slowly becoming the one single friend in my entire friend group. I felt like my social skills and dating life were slowly diminishing the longer I stayed home and didn't go out. That's when I decided to log onto my desktop computer and create a new Tinder profile. After a couple of minutes of typing out a witty personal bio, I started uploading old photos to my profile. I made sure to also download the app on my phone while making myself comfortable on my living room couch. I remember swiping through the app for a few minutes and seeing dozens of attractive females. Due to my previous encounters regarding dating apps, I knew not to trust the pictures within the girls' profiles, as some of them could turn out to be catfishes more often than not. During the latter part of my evening, I was waiting patiently to match with any girls on Tinder. My dad always told me to shoot my shot with as many girls as possible. That way the probability of hooking up with one would be higher than the average guy. I recall swiping right and liking at least 100 girls' profiles on Tinder. Out of the hundreds of girls, I surprisingly got no matches back. I couldn't help but feel my self-esteem gradually deplete. I didn't want to sour the rest of my day, so I decided to put my phone down and watch some TV for the remainder of the evening. My anxiety began playing tricks on me as I truly convinced myself that I was going to be single forever. The room suddenly became silent despite the television still remaining on. My eyes started getting heavy the longer I stared at the TV. I began picking at the armrest of my sofa while trying to blow off some steam. Feelings of anxiety weighed heavy on my shoulders. Am I really gonna die single? Does anyone want to be with me? That's when I hear a notification sound coming from my phone. I grabbed my phone and noticed it was a match from someone on Tinder. As I opened up the app, I noticed a female of Asian descent. She didn't have many pictures on her profile, just one picture with the name Tina. From the looks of it, she seemed fairly attractive and was roughly around the same age group as I was. The bio on her profile was straight to the point. I remember it saying something along the lines of, "The hotter twin sister, you should date me." I found the description rather odd, but brushed it off as I just wanted to get some action that night. That's when she sent a direct message to me. I opened up the message, which read,
"I'd love to talk in person if you're free,"
with a smiley emoji. I was surprised at how forward she was. Her location said she lived about 15 kilometers away, which translated to about a 10-minute drive from my house, give or take. I figured meeting up with this girl wouldn't be much of an inconvenience considering how close she was. I sent a message asking for her contact information. She then responds with her fully disclosed address and phone number. Again, I was taken aback by how forward she was with her contact details. I began speculating if she was a catfish or not. Nonetheless, I brushed the notion under the rug and decided to respond back with, Cool, be there in an hour. As I made my way to the washroom for a quick shower, my entire body began feeling antsy. I couldn't help but feel genuinely excited as if I was going on a first date again. That's when I hear another notification sound coming from my phone. I checked my phone and saw another match coming from Tinder. Could this be my lucky day? I wondered. I clicked on the profile and noticed it was Tina, except the name on the profile said Lena. As I read her bio, I could see it was similar to Tina's profile saying, "The hotter twin sister, you should date me." The distance next to her name was also 15 kilometers. Could it be? This has to be the twin she was talking about. Speculations began running through my head. I made the assumption that Tina and Lena were both twin sisters, considering the identical similarities in names, appearance, and location. It seemed like the pair had a pretty petty relationship with one another based on the way they were outing each other on their bios. She then messages me as well saying,
Don't date my sister Tina. Date me instead.
I couldn't help but feel amused at the notion that I literally had twin sisters fighting over me that I hadn't even met yet. Not really considering if this was a good idea or not, I decided to entertain it by saying, "How about we all go on a triple date?" Lena then responds with,
Fine, but you better like me more.
My mind was racing. I couldn't believe I was going to potentially hook up with two attractive-looking twins. Something on every guy's bucket list. That being said, I grabbed my car keys and made my way inside my vehicle. I punched in the address on Google Maps and started driving towards the destination. About 10 to 15 minutes later, I arrived there and saw a fairly small house surrounded by a lot of trees. The house honestly looked like a shack that you would put storage in. I casually make my way onto the porch and began knocking on the door. I remember hearing faint noises of heavy footsteps making their way towards my direction. As I heard the door locks beginning to open, I popped a breath mint in my mouth to give a good impression. The door began to creak open, and there stood a girl with two heads attached to her body. If I recall the politically correct term, they were conjoined twins. The girl on the right then introduced herself saying,
I'm Tina, also known as the hotter twin, and here is my uglier half, Lena.
Speak for yourself. Anyway, I'm Lena. You must be Jeff, right?
Yeah.
Come inside so we can get this party started.
I honestly contemplated on booking it, as it was clear as day that I'd been catfished, but I decided to take the high road and continue with the date, so I said, sure, ladies. As I made my way inside, I couldn't help but notice how well kept the place was. There were even 3 plates of steak preps sitting on the dining room table. I felt a little relieved I didn't split the scene, as I would have lived to regret leaving the twins high and dry despite all their efforts. We all began to walk towards the table. I sat on one side while the twins sat across from me. An awkward essence filled the room as I couldn't believe who I was currently on a date with. If I had to be honest, I couldn't muster up an appetite despite how delicious the meal looked. Tina held the steak with a fork in place while Lena began slicing it into bite-sized pieces. I sat there watching with my jaw hanging from my face as the twins started feeding themselves with their respective hands. I genuinely don't mean to be rude, but it was the most bizarre thing to watch considering it wasn't expected. Tina then says,
Why aren't you eating your steak, Jeff? I worked on it all day.
Leave him alone. He doesn't want to eat your shitty cooking.
I didn't ask you, idiot.
I wish we were separated. I can't stand you.
Psh, at least I don't have to share the same brain as you.
Girls, please stop fighting. I'm just a little full from the food I had earlier.
Who do you think's hotter? Me or her?
I'm not here to pick favorites, Tina.
He obviously likes me more.
There's a reason why I was born on the right side. Because I'm Mrs. Right.
Condescending bitch.
Girls, if you don't stop, I'm leaving.
The tension in the room got very uncomfortable. Both twins began to mean mug me while holding a knife in one hand and a fork in the other. I could hear nothing but pin drops as the room suddenly became silent. Tina then slams her clenched fist on the table while holding the fork in her palm, saying,
You're not going anywhere, Jeff.
What are you talking about? The twins then got up from their chair and began approaching my direction. I began leaning back the closer they got to me. "Ladies, can you please put the knife and fork down?" As I looked into their eyes, I could see them both filled with rage, while Lena's had a hint of concern within them. Tina then abruptly takes a swipe across my face with the fork in her hand.
Ow! What the hell is your problem? Get the hell away from me or I'm calling the cops!
I sat in my seat flabbergasted while trying to subdue the blood dripping down my face. Lena then says,
Why did you do that? If you go to jail, they're gonna put me in there with you, you idiot!
Good. Not only will we be close physically, but we'll also be close emotionally.
Lena then begins stabbing Tina across her face and neck repeatedly. I sat there in disbelief while being showered in their blood. As Lena continuously stabbed Tina, I saw her eyes beginning to slowly roll in the back of her head as the pair abruptly collapsed on the floor.
The first place I lived in after moving out of my parents' house was this tiny, dingy apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the nicest place, but it was affordable, and it was mine. Because the rent was so cheap, there were quite a few students from the nearby community college living there. Most of us were friendly with each other, and we'd hang out sometimes. But there was one guy who just killed the vibe whenever he was around. I don't think any of us knew his name or even really managed to have a conversation with him. We all mentioned seeing him linger in the laundry room, despite him wearing the same set of clothes every single day. Most of us wrote him off as the token creep of the neighborhood. This is just what you get for trying to save on rent. After all, he wasn't the only downside to that particular apartment complex. The walls were pretty much paper thin. I could usually hear just about everything go on in my neighboring apartments. That being said, I still didn't mind. My next-door neighbor was this really attractive girl from the community college. Of course, I always hoped that being so close to her meant that we'd eventually run into each other and maybe hit it off, but I didn't actually see much of her. Unfortunately, it was almost like she was trying to avoid being seen, as she would run out of her door and slam it in the middle of the night all the time. But since the walls were so thin, I could hear most of what she was like without meeting her. She was on her phone a lot, talking really loud to someone on the other side. Every once in a while, she'd have a friend over for the night and I'd lose some sleep. But otherwise, she seemed like a nice person to me. There was one night, though, where things seemed off. It was a Sunday night and I'd fallen asleep quite heavily after hanging out with my friends for a few hours. I woke up in the dead of night to the sounds of shouting and screaming coming through the wall from inside her apartment.
Get out! You're ugly! Like I'd ever. Ah!
It sounded like a heated argument, which was weird. I'd never heard my neighbor fight before. I could tell someone else was in the apartment. They were talking back.
Come on, please?
I shrugged it off and rolled over in my bed, thinking he was some lackluster playboy getting burnt and butted out. It was none of my business, and I didn't have the energy to do anything about it, so I went back to sleep. But the next morning, I woke up worried. For some reason, I had a sinking feeling about my neighbor. I stepped outside of my apartment and knocked on her door. Hello? There was no answer. I knocked a few more times, but still, nothing on the other side. I sighed in frustration and stepped back. We were on the second floor breezeway, so I leaned up against the railing and looked around the parking lot for her car. The parking spots were assigned in the same order as the apartments, so her car would be right next to mine. Her car is here. I thought I heard the door open, but when I turned back, it wasn't her who answered. The door to the other apartment next to hers was ajar, and the eyes of the neighborhood creep were staring at me. Can I help you? What's the deal with all the knocking? I had no idea he even lived in that unit until then. I never saw him enter or exit once in the months I'd been there. Slowly, I walked up to his doorway, but he continued to hide behind his door. Hey, have you seen your neighbor? Who? The girl, man. You know who I'm talking about. Oh, the girl. Her name was Lily. He scowled at me like I offended him, but I was confused. How did he know her name and I didn't? Oh, wait, man. What do you mean her name was Lily? I don't know. You don't know? Whatever. Look, I'm worried about her. I heard some crazy stuff from her place last night, and she's not answering her door. Have you seen her recently? I don't know. You don't know if you've seen her recently? Dude, I know your walls are just as thin as mine. I know you heard something weird last night, too. Come on, you heard it, didn't you? I don't know. All of a sudden, I realized just how crazy tense the creep had become. He still held the door half closed with white knuckles, sweat dripping down his forehead. He was no longer actually saying anything, but he never broke eye contact with me for a moment. Hey, I don't want to freak you out. I'm sorry. Why don't we just sit down inside and talk about this? It's early. No! The creep slammed the door shut with surprising strength, and right on my finger. Ah! 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 Oh, that bastard! I reeled back and reluctantly looked at my hand. Yeah, we'll say that finger was definitely broken. One more thing about cheap rent. You get cheap locks. In the rush of shock and anger, the sight of my gnarly finger broke me. I kicked the creep's door as hard as I could, channeling all the pain into it. I really didn't expect it to happen, but the creep's door flew open with a burst of splinters and a wimpy scream from the creep himself. But that didn't matter when I caught a glimpse through his doorway and into his living room. I saw just where my good neighbor had gone. She was chopped up into several pieces, arranged on the floor as part of some ritual involving drawings in her blood, and a lot of her dirty laundry, which I assume he stole. Dozens of bloody bras were strung around his room, along with several clumps of Lily's ginger hair, some pieces with scalps still attached to it. The sight was unbearable. I'd seen enough for a morning. I didn't want to fight a guy who chops up bodies, or be his neighbor, for that matter. It was a terrible tragedy what happened to that girl, and I feel stupid and guilty to this day, knowing that I might have been able to do something about it, but didn't even try. I didn't stay for long. Right after I got off the phone with the police, I called my landlord and broke my lease. I couldn't believe I was able to sleep through the murder of my neighbor. All I can say is, this is the last time I will ever rent out a cheap room, because you truly get what you pay for.
I mean, we just don't know where she is.
What about the parking lot area? I think that's where they have recovered the body or whatever they recovered from there.
Body?
They took out a body there earlier. We don't know if it's the same person or not. Are you okay, sir?
I think I need to sit down.
Who in that complex do I need to talk to?
I don't know.
Tell me. I want to know.
I don't know where she is.
Why is there blood in your bathroom?
I don't know.
Yes, you do know. Why, Steven? Who did it?
I don't know.
I can't imagine most people have enthralling dinners under the roof of a KFC. But I, for one, remember dining there far more times than the average person. It used to be something my parents would do for me and my siblings back in the day. It wasn't enough for them to just bring it home. They wanted it to be more than just takeout. A family outing, they would always say. That said, I couldn't tell you I hated the place until the last time I went, only a few weeks ago. I was just about to move out of my parents' house, and they'd convinced me to go with them to KFC one last time, before I'd taken flight or whatever. It was purely nostalgic. I don't think any one of us still cared for the food there. It's different now. Anyways, my parents and I were just minding our business in the dining room of the KFC, chewing on regrettable numbers of questionable pieces of fried chicken in complete silence. My dad had just excused himself to the restroom after I tried to break the ice by asking what him and my mom would do after I left home. That's when this man barged in. A man that looked exactly like the Colonel of Kentucky Fried fame. But it couldn't be him. The real Colonel was long dead. Everyone in the building, the customers and the employees, all turned their heads at this guy.
Well, a mighty fine Friday afternoon to y'all. I'm Colonel Sanders.
Right as he started speaking, I think the majority of us dropped our guard. By that point, everyone had seen the new commercials for KFC with that weird-looking spokesman/character person, and this guy nailed the act. It seemed obvious that this was some sort of corporate PR stunt, complete with an actor for the mascot and a room full of real, unwilling customers. For the most part, though, people just shrugged and went back to eating idly as the Colonel continued.
I care indubitably for the quality of my establishments, which is why I'll be performing a full top-down inspection of this franchise today for all of you wonderful folks. Yes, managers, go check for a special message on your computers.
The employees seemed to believe the guy too, at least for the moment, so the rest of us went along with it. I was just hoping we weren't being filmed by some hidden camera crew. Though my mother and I went on pretending to talk to each other, we were watching the Colonel from the corner of our eyes. He'd started his inspection in the dining room, walking up to all the tables and asking each of the customers,
How's your food, sir? The staff treat you well? Everything to your liking?
But each time, with every customer, at the end of his questions, he'd lean over the table and stare unflinchingly down into their eyes and ask,
Tell me, is it finger-licking good?
Most of the responses were a short, yeah, sure, or an, I think we're done here. The Colonel would then hover over them for a few seconds while smirking. He then did the strangest thing. He started licking his own fingers. Slowly, people started to become a little more aware of him. The scene was weird as he would stare directly into customers' eyes while doing this action. I just hoped that he wouldn't visit our table. With that being said, he scurried over to us as though he could read my mind.
Well, how nice to see a young man repay his mother with a nice dinner.
He spoke to both of us, but he only looked at me. And by that I mean, he didn't blink, twitch, or glance away even a little bit.
You're a fine young man, ain't you, boy?
I started trembling. I knew this dinner was going to be tense, but I hadn't thought I'd be put on the spot quite like this. Thank you, sir.
No. Thank you for dining here, son. How's your fried chicken? Tell me, is it up to your standards? I trust you now.
My eyes darted around looking for a response, a sign from my mom, or to see my dad appear from the restroom. But everything seemed frozen. Very suddenly, the Colonel fell to his knees beside me, reaching for my hands.
Tell me now, boy, is it finger-licking good?
He kept leaning in towards me with his mouth hanging open, staring at my fingers, like he himself was about to lick the crumbs off of them to prove it. That's when my dad finally got off the toilet and came back to his family. He shouted,
Hey, weirdo!
He then yanked that wacko away from me faster than I could even react. The Colonel tumbled to the greasy floor of the dining room.
You trying to propose to my son, punk? Get out of here before I make you wish I was a cop!
Whoever that guy was, he wasn't official KFC staff, but he was definitely a wimp. He didn't put up any sort of fight after my dad threw him. He just rushed to his feet, laughed at us for a moment, then ran out the door.
Come on, Margaret. We're getting out of here.
We all got up and left the table. And I think that'll be the last time I ever step foot within 100 feet of a KFC. Later that weekend, my dad caught the news from the local channel which stated, the guy who impersonated the Colonel had gotten arrested the night after we saw him. Reports say he disguised himself as the mascot to get into close proximity with customers to harass them. He then took it a step further by grabbing their greasy fingers and biting them off. He would flee the scene immediately after and hit up at least 5 locations before getting caught by the police. Several people were missing fingers from that one spree. I was stunned to think just how close I'd gotten to becoming an unfortunate victim of that weirdo's hunt for greasy fingers. And to this day, I get queasy whenever I see fried chicken.
This is a true story that happened a couple of years ago, when Tinder was the go-to place for online dating. My experience with Tinder, or should I say with this one individual, was at first a friendly and flirtatious experience turned fatal the further things went. It all started when I was doing night classes at my local community college. At the time, I was studying to get my degree in nursing, so you can imagine the monotonous lectures that the course entailed. I would usually take pictures of my friends' notes so that I didn't have to take notes during lectures. Instead, I would go on Tinder. I was single at the time and figured I could pursue a boyfriend since December was considered cuffing season. I remember messaging this attractive guy who I'll call Ryan for the sake of this story. Ryan was my type of guy, handsome and someone who enjoyed the nature and wildlife. From his profile pictures, I could see him holding a machete while wearing camo attire. After our initial match, I got to know Ryan a lot more and found out that he was a huntsman who also enjoyed fishing on his days off. Nonetheless, his good looks and charm gave me good vibes that the other guys on Tinder didn't. We had messaged back and forth for about a week or two and even video chatted occasionally. My friends and school colleagues suggested I give him a shot at a first date, but I felt like I wanted to take things slow and steady. This is when things took a dark and unexpected turn. One night, my best friend Jenna sends me a link of Ryan's personal Facebook page. As I opened his page up on my desktop computer, I see that he was currently in a relationship with another female of Hispanic descent. I began to act irrational and bombarded him with texts saying stuff like,
"Why the hell would you lead me on if you're still in a relationship? I saw your Facebook, buddy."
Not even 10 seconds later, Ryan responds back saying, "I was planning on breaking up with her to be with you." I didn't want to be known as a homewrecker, but he was too irresistible to let go of, considering how much in common I had with him. I messaged back saying,
"So you're willing to break up with her to be with me?"
"Yes, I'll break it to her later tonight."
"How will she take the news?"
Sometimes you just gotta kill him with kindness. After an awkward turn of events, I shut off my computer, put my phone on silent, and headed to bed, while brushing the whole notion under the rug that I was going to end a relationship and potentially gain one simultaneously. The next morning, I woke up and checked my cell phone on my nightstand. I remember seeing 2 missed messages from Ryan. I opened them up and saw an image of his girlfriend, except she was bloodied. A good portion of her face was severed off with a second message that read, "Done." After the alleged homicide circulated the news, it was later found out that Ryan had taken his girlfriend's life with his hunting machete. What makes this story more disturbing was how I recall Ryan explicitly saying he was going to quote-unquote kill his girlfriend with kindness prior to breaking up with her. Little did I know that his hunting machete was named Kindness.
I used to be friends with this guy who worked at KFC. His name was Jake. I knew him for years throughout school. When we got out, we ended up getting jobs at the same strip mall. I worked at the GameStop just across the parking lot from the KFC he worked at. I could see the Colonel's sign out of the window all day long, so by the end of my shifts, I was usually craving some fried chicken. Plus, it was always nice to stop by and talk to my friend Jake at the register. After I finished work one night, I decided to buy some chicken for dinner and to remind Jake to get on Call of Duty once he got home. I knew he was working that night, and he told me his shift would be ending soon after mine. However, I didn't see him when I walked into the restaurant. Actually, there was hardly anyone in there,
except one person behind the register where Jake should have been standing. I'd never seen this guy before. For some reason, he looked out of place behind a fast food counter, like it was his first day or something. He stared at me awkwardly as I approached the register. To my surprise, however, his customer service was more friendly and hospitable than just about anyone I'd ever seen working minimum wage. "Good evening, sir. How may I take your order?" Have you seen Jake? I wanted to stop by and say hi to him." "Oh, Jake's on break, good sir, but I can help you." On break? It didn't make sense that Jake would wait until the end of his shift to take his only break. I tried to discreetly look behind the guy at the counter and into the kitchen. From what I could see, the kitchen was empty. There was nobody at work back there. No cleaning, no dishwashing going on, not one sound or sight in the whole place except me and this weird guy, and he didn't even have a name tag. "Excuse me, I don't mean to be that guy, but is your manager around?" "I am the manager, good sir. Yes, it's just me tonight, holding it down for the customers." "Why do you ask? Are you interested in becoming part of the KFC team?" Thank you, but no, I'm already employed." I was still wearing my GameStop uniform at the time, so I pointed to my name tag. "Ah, well, I see. It's a shame, though. You would have made great fried chicken. Could I just get a 10-piece bucket and a Coke?" "Sure thing, Flynn. Cash only, by the way. The card reader's broken." I handed him $10 and reluctantly tipped him some quarters from the change he gave me. I felt a little bad for being rude to the guy, but I just felt so much more at ease when he finally walked away. It took him several minutes to come back with my order, even though no other customers came inside or through the drive-thru while I waited. Every one of those minutes was tense. All I wanted to do was get my fried chicken, go home, and play some video games with my friend, wherever he was. When, at last, I finally got my meal, I grabbed it and rushed out of there, paying no attention to the bone-chilling ear-to-ear grin on that weird guy's face as he handed me the bucket. I sped off in my car and drove home in a rush to get away from him. I changed out of my work clothes in a flash, then got online and ready to game. While I waited for Jake to get on, I started to eat my dinner for the night. 10 delicious pieces of heart-stopping, artery-clogging fried chicken. I remember thinking to myself as I mowed through the pieces, "Man, this has got to be the best Kentucky Fried Chicken I've ever had." I guess that guy could have been the manager. It's so good. It doesn't even taste like chicken. Maybe it's duck. After a while, I started to slow down. Jake still hadn't got on, and I only had about 3 pieces of chicken left. That's when I noticed something strange at the bottom of the bucket. It was breaded like fried chicken, but it was too small to be that. It was a small rectangular thing. Out of curiosity, I fished it out of the bucket. As soon as I picked it up, all the breading crumbled away, revealing a small piece of white plastic with a pin glued onto it. Did that weird guy lose his name tag in the batter? But when I turned it over, the name printed on it was... Jake! The whole time I'd been waiting on him, he was wafting into my nose, getting ground between my teeth, and sliding down into my stomach. No, this can't be. I dropped the bucket onto the ground as I trembled at the thought. Was that really Jake? I couldn't believe it. I picked up my phone and called Jake, but there was no answer. I panicked. I quickly called his mom, only to find out that Jake had not come home that night. Tell me, is it finger-licking good?
I'd started using Tinder just a few weeks prior. I hadn't expected it to work, but within a short time, it seemed to be proving fruitful. One day, I saw this super hot chick right in my area. She was just my type, and she had plenty of great photos on her profile. To my surprise, we matched pretty quickly. We started texting on and off throughout the week. She always took a while to respond, but I figured she was just playing hard to get because all of her texts were heavily flirtatious, saying out-of-pocket things like,
"Hey there, Mr. Man. You look pretty hot. Want to make out with me?"
I really wanted things to go to the next level, so I played along. I pulled out all the stops, using all the pickup lines and wit I had. You know, I'm gonna take you out first. Gotta treat a classy girl like you, right? Things got rather heated pretty soon.
How about I just give you a time and a place, and you just do me right?
I'll be there. Eventually, after about a week, we traded phone numbers and I got her to agree to go out on a date. She said she really wanted to go to the movies. I didn't really care where we were, as long as I finally got to meet her. I arrived at the theater around the start of the previews, but she'd already texted me that she was inside.
I'm way up at the very top. XOXO.
When I made my way to the top row, I saw a girl sitting by herself. She didn't look exactly like the photos from her profile, but still, she was cute. I figured it was just too dark in the theater to tell, and she had the right brunette hair, so I introduced myself on the steps. Hey there, lovely. Mind if I take a seat?
Excuse me? Who are you?
I'm Aaron. From Tinder?
I think you got the wrong girl.
My bad. Sorry about that. I looked around the theater for another girl sitting alone, but there was hardly anyone in there. Well, there was nobody except her. She was waving at me from the other side of the row. Even in the dark, I could see enough. As she flailed her arm around, a hefty baggage of fat, flabby skin jiggled around her elbow. Her waist bulged over the armrests of her seat, and she had about $50 of concessions cluttered around herself. I gulped and reluctantly walked over to her. I already knew I'd been severely catfished, but I put myself to just getting through the movie and then never talking to her again.
Hey, hot stuff.
Hi. Once I got close, I noticed even more disgusting details. She looked older and more wrinkled than my grandma, which just made all the folds of fat that much more numerous. She barely had any hair left on the top of her head, except for a few greasy white wisps, but she made up for it with a scraggly beard nestled between a few of her chins. What I wanted to do was vomit, but I sat down despite myself. Immediately, she grabbed my hand from my leg and clenched it with an iron grip. She pulled me towards herself and whispered into my ear.
How'd you like to go all the way tonight, baby boy?
I don't know.
Oh, are you nervous, sweetheart? Not as bold as you are in your texts, hmm? Well, how about we start with a little kiss?
I wanted to leave so bad, but I was hung up on getting my money's worth out of the ticket. She was still squeezing the life out of my hand, licking her lips and letting food spill out of her mouth. I don't think so. How about we just enjoy the movie?
Oh, come on. Aren't you a player? Get over here.
She puckered up and pulled me in even further. I tried to wriggle myself free, but she grabbed my face with her other hand and held me still as she kissed me with her Funyun breath. She forced her way into my mouth and then bit my tongue. When I tasted blood, something juiced me with extra adrenaline. I punched her in the face and jumped out of my seat. But something was still biting my tongue, pulling it out of my mouth and hanging off my chin. I looked down. It was her dentures, yellowed and covered in food and still clenched onto me. Ah! I ripped them off and threw them to the floor. Out of grabbing distance, I looked back at her, utterly stunned.
Where you going, baby boy?
She tried to stand up, knocking several empty snack cartons onto the floor, but she didn't get anywhere. She was wedged into her seat by the girth of her hips. It was like watching a train wreck. I couldn't look away. When she finally twisted and heaved herself out of the seat, she immediately collapsed to the floor, then started crawling towards me, rambling unintelligible gibberish. She didn't get very far before she got stuck in the cramped space of the aisle. Suddenly, she started screaming in rage, kicking her feet hopelessly and swiping at me with her meat hooks. You really let yourself go. How embarrassing. I couldn't stand to look at her any longer. I got the heck out of there before anyone else showed up. And really, I needed to get home and wash my mouth out with bleach. Over 10 years ago now, my parents and I moved into a duplex. It wasn't ideal for a family, but it was what we could afford after the housing crisis, although I was too young to understand that at the time. Most of our neighbors were friendly. The weekend after we moved in, several of them came over for a night of housewarming to welcome the new residents to the neighborhood and that sort of thing. It was getting late by the time they all arrived. My parents told me I was up too far past my bedtime and sent me to my room for the night. That bedroom shared a wall with the living room in which my parents and all the guests were talking. Since I wasn't given much of a choice, I decided to listen in on what the adults were saying. I could hear most of it, but I didn't understand very much. Though, there was one thing I did catch. They talked a lot about our next-door neighbor in the house connected to ours. He used to be a nice guy, but ever since his wife divorced him, he's gone down the deep end. He keeps to himself these days, but I keep an eye out for him. I'll try, but I haven't seen him since we moved in. What's he got behind those hedges, anyway? He gardens. It's all he cares about anymore. He and his wife used to plant all sorts of stuff. She's not around anymore, but I guess he keeps the tradition going. For some reason, the mention of our next-door neighbor gave me the chills. We'd been there for a few days, but I hadn't seen him once. Even to a kid, it was unsettling. I decided to stop eavesdropping and go to sleep. That would be one of the last times I ever got a good night's rest. A few nights later, I was running up and down the stairs when I noticed that we had a window halfway up the stairwell that looked out onto the backyard. I stopped to examine our neighbor's side of the backyard, which he had put up a fence to keep separated from our half. He even planted a 10-foot hedge behind the fence for added scenery, but I could see it all from the stairs. His half of the yard was overgrown with rows of thriving bushes and flowers, with a greenhouse in the far corner. I couldn't see through the glass, though. The inside was thick with vines. As I was watching, I finally saw the neighbor appear from within the greenhouse. He was filthy and fidgeted incessantly. He looked around as if to see if anyone was spying on him, then limped hurriedly into his house. I knew he was up to something fishy. My curiosity had been building since we moved in, and it got the best of me in that moment. I snuck past my parents and went out into the backyard. It was a full moon. While I knew he was still inside, I climbed over the fence and dropped in behind the hedge. I immediately regretted my boneheaded decision, as I was now stuck between the splinters of the fence and the thorns of the thickest hedge I'd ever seen. But I didn't have time to climb back up. The man busted open the back door and barreled outside. I stood motionless and spied him from the shadows as he came back to the greenhouse. This time, he was completely cleaned and dressed in a three-piece suit. He stood before the greenhouse door and straightened his tie, as if he was trying to calm his nerves. I miss you, Martha, but you've made your decision. I will keep our memory alive in the sanctuary of life and greenery. Life that you will nourish and support with your own flesh. The children we planted together are so grateful that you've come back to stay with us. Suddenly, he yanked open the door and went into the greenhouse. He barricaded himself inside for several minutes, and the whole time he was screaming softly and giggling with excitement like a little kid at a sleepover. But in between his clown sounds, I heard sawing and jangling chains. After a while, he stumbled out, panting and filthy again. Under the light of the full moon, I could see that he was not caked with dirt, but with blood. In terror, I watched him slink back into his house to wash up once more. I was mortified, but I had to see what he was doing in there, because it was definitely not gardening. I mustered up the courage to crawl through the bramble of the hedge and sneak up to the greenhouse. I gripped the latch, pulled back the door, and peeked in. An old woman was strung up by the hands and feet. Her back was cut open. exposing her lungs and spine, her ribs severed and flayed out like wings. That image, I see it every time I blink, but I couldn't look away. As I stared, I saw something even worse. Her lungs, they were still breathing, rising and falling before my eyes. I ran away and jumped the fence like an Olympian. At that point, I gave up on being a junior investigator and handed it off to my parents and the police. But no matter what I try to do, even after all these years later, I can't unsee what I saw. This is a story I must tell for the sake of my own conscience, and for the sake of anyone who thinks it's harmless to hit on a Hooters girl. For my own protection, I'll go by Lola for the purpose of this story. I had a brief stint as a waitress at a Hooters in the Deep South, and I am now stricken with paralyzing fear at the mere sight of a Hooters, or even a moderately attractive woman in a tank top and short shorts. I needed a job, and at the time I didn't care if it meant getting gawked at by hungry creeps. Waiting tables at Hooters was better than stripping, though it didn't pay as well. Things started out fine. I was scheduled for the slow hours on the off days, and I thought I was handling it pretty well. The routine was simple. Take the customer's greasy orders, giggle and smile at whatever they say, and collect your tips. Week 2 was when things took a turn. My manager, whom we'll call Shannon, tasked me with waiting on a regular, whom we'll call Clayton. Immediately, I knew that there was something off about this guy. He sat alone, slouched at a high top in the back corner, underneath a burnt-out light bulb. Even from that distance, he was staring dead at me with piercing, sullen eyes. Nonetheless, I got to it. Those tips don't earn themselves. But once I got close, I started to doubt if he'd even have the cash for the check. He looked like a bum, about to part from the land of the living, and his stench preceded him. I pushed through it. I wouldn't get reprimanded over this guy. I began with the trademark hospitality.
Welcome to Hooters, darling. Would you like to start with a drink?
I'll have a tall glass of you.
Oh, come on. You're a regular. You know better than that.
Clayton then gave me a taste of his wretched halitosis, leaning in far too close for comfort. How do you know I'm a regular here? I haven't seen you around. Them other girls been talking about me, huh? They tell you how good I am with women?
They're just showing me the ropes, dearie. You ready for that drink yet?
Huh. Playing hard to get, I see. Yeah, whatever. I'll have a cup from your freshest pot of coffee. And make sure it's fresh.
Sure thing. And are you ready for an app or an entree? Or do you need another minute?
I'm ready for my meal. I wanted to speed things up so I could get away for some fresh air.
What will it be?
I'll have a sloppy feast between them cheeks.
Ugh!
I was nearly fed up. I turned away to storm off. Hold on there, sweet cheeks. Get me a burger. Shannon knows just how I like it.
Hamburger. Got it.
As I finally walked away, I thought I'd get a break, but then he slapped my butt.
Jerk!
I thought.
You just crossed a hard line, bucko.
I marched up to the bar where my manager was pouring a pint.
Shannon, I've made a mistake. I'm putting...
Shannon hushed me. The customers were always eavesdropping after all.
Now hold on, sweetie.
She leaned over the bar and whispered into my ear.
I know what you're going through. Since you've done so well so far, I'll go ahead and forgive your little outburst. In return, because I'm such a nice gal, I'm gonna let you in on our little secret for handling our more unsavory patrons. I just need a favor from you. There's a shed behind the restaurant. I need you to invite our nuisance back there for a little private session. You feel me? Shannon, I will not. I said, do you feel me?
I should have quit right then and there. I should have just bolted out the door and never looked back. Unfortunately, my bank account wouldn't let me walk out just yet. I sighed and obliged, returning to Clayton's table. Getting him to follow me was a breeze. At the mere suggestion of a close encounter with yours truly, he hopped off his stool and shadowed me like a dog. I could almost hear him panting behind me. I'm not gonna lie, I felt pretty powerful in that moment, having such complete control over this fool. Still, I was trembling internally about what laid ahead. My guess was as good as yours. I was hoping there'd be muscle waiting at the back door to beat him into a pulp and teach him a lesson. But when we got out and there was nothing but an open field to greet us, that hope vanished. Since battery was literally my best case scenario, I was having serious regrets about going along with this. I swallowed my fear and continued to the dilapidated shed where Shannon waited for us with a keychain in hand. So this is the Love Shack, huh? Looks just like the place I had a threesome back in '93.
I'm sure it does, Clayton.
Shannon was still placating him. Then, she unfastened the padlock and yanked the chain off the barn door, pulling it open with one slow creaking motion. It was broad daylight outside, but the interior of the shed was engulfed in shadow. A smell like spoiled beef wafted outward, but Clayton did not take heed. He grabbed my hand and pulled me into it. Deep into the dark, I wriggled free of Clayton's grasp and waited anxiously for my eyes to adjust. Sounds unfolded all around me. The rummaging of Clayton undressing, the door squealing shut, wicked giggling, footsteps. Then, Shannon turned on the light. In that moment, Clayton and I suddenly related on something. Utter shock as we took in our new surroundings. This was no ordinary shed. A single old-timey light bulb hung from a chain, casting a sinister orange glow on the shelves cluttered with human bones, rotting guts, and the tools of torture. Everything was coated in blood splattered from barbaric wounds, dried urine spilt by victims who couldn't hold it in with all their fright, and so much other filth I don't even want to mention. In the center of it all was an examination chair straight out of a psych ward, complete with the add-ons of a demented sadist. That room, I see it in my nightmares every single night. Poor Clayton didn't even have time to run for the door. I watched in terror as Shannon clubbed him over the head with a meat tenderizer, sending his half-nakedness clattering to the squalid ground. Shannon heaved him up with surprising strength, fastening his body into the torture chair with death-stained leather straps strangling all his pressure points.
Now do you see, Lola?
Shannon stared into my soul with eyes of pure lunacy.
This is how we handle the stress brought on by waste of flesh like him.
I had no words. Shannon still held the meat tenderizer with white knuckles in one hand, holding out a rusty chef's knife in the other.
Would you like to make the first cut?
I stuttered like an idiot.
This, what?
Suddenly, Clayton came to.
Don't do this! I'm a cop! You'll rot for this!
Shannon struck him in the face with the tenderizer multiple times, turning his face into a mess like a bloody waffle.
I can't believe I forgot to gag you.
Shannon went searching through the shelves for a diseased cloth to shove in his mouth. While she had her back turned, I saw my opening and burst out of the door. I fled from my life, sprinting with more speed and stamina than I'd ever mustered before. I wasn't about to get involved in this demonic release, and I wasn't about to meet the fate of a brainless horror film floozy. I wasn't feeling the generosity of heroism or responsibility. I entered unconditional self-preservation mode and skipped town. I left everything behind. Since then, I've changed my name, my hair, my whole wardrobe, and moved to an entirely different region of the United States. I've tried as hard as I can to forget about everything I saw and keep myself from the crosshairs of the law and that honking hooter serial killer. As far as I'm concerned, they all deserve to be abandoned to their fates.
I just can't move on. That's why I'm putting this story out into the world, in the hopes that people on the edge of catastrophe will hear this and think twice. If you value your life whatsoever, for God's sake, don't hit on the waitress.
This is a deadly tale that would leave one shook to their very core. What makes things worse was how I had to experience it and live to tell about it. The depictions of what transpired are very disturbing, and to what some would refer to as inhumane. I still don't understand why things happened the way they did. All I know is that I am truly scarred for the rest of my life. It all started when I was in my late 20s. I was currently living with my parents and had saved up a considerable amount financially. Of course, being in my late 20s, I desperately wanted to move out, so I began looking for some real estate agents to help search for an affordable house. After a month or two of heavy searching, I found a local agent who had a decent amount of experience. I remember he was showcasing a house for sale that was about an hour away from my parents' place. My agent ended up scheduling an open house appointment so that I could take a house tour to see if I was interested. When that day finally arrived, my agent and my dad and I drove to the destination on a Sunday afternoon. On our way there, I recall seeing dozens of farms, farm animals, and farmers. This part of town was obviously where the countryside was, so it was quite the drastic change compared to the city life I was used to. When we arrived there, I remember seeing a decent-sized home with a for sale sign on the lawn. At first glance, the house looked pretty decent. I could honestly tell that whoever lived in that house knew how to keep their home pretty well kept. As we made our way onto the front porch, we got greeted by a middle-aged couple. The man introduces himself and his wife as Joe and Sally. My agent introduces my dad and I respectively as we all began making our way inside the house. I recall the house not being too big but relatively decent size. It consisted of 2 floors with 2 bedrooms and 1 washroom. To be honest, I was already sold on the place. The house met all my needs and seemed to be in pretty pristine condition. I expressed my intentions with the homeowners and could visibly see how excited the couple got. I assumed they were excited to move out and wanted to get rid of the burden of having the house on sale. We then proceeded to make our way out of the house, and from the corner of my eye, I saw the couple looking at the ceiling with their hands clasped together, chanting a prayer. I found it a bit alarming, but shrugged the notion off, assuming they were just really religious. After a week of consulting with my agent and parents, I concluded with the decision of proceeding with the purchase. The house was being sold at a surprisingly low price, which obviously fit within my budget. I ended up signing all the paperwork and put a down payment on the house. During my first day of moving in, my dad and older cousin helped me move some furniture into my new home. I recall seeing my new neighbor standing outside his front porch. He looked like an older gentleman that was roughly within his late 40s. We both made eye contact and I saw him politely waving at me. I then waved back at him and said, "Hey, you must be my new neighbor." "Indeed. My name is Sebastian, but you can call me Bash for short." "Okay, nice to meet you, Bash. I'm Jack. Do you require any help moving your belongings in?" "No, it's fine, I think." "Nonsense! Let me give you a hand." Sebastian then inserts himself within my parameters and casually introduces himself to my dad and cousin. Throughout the rest of the day, we successfully moved our belongings within the household and share a few laughs with Sebastian. Despite the initial odd introduction, he turned out to be a pretty laid-back kind of guy. We all even shared a beer or two as the night was pretty swell to say the least. At around 11 p.m., my dad and cousin finally left the house, leaving Sebastian and I alone. I noticed Sebastian staring at a painting of Mona Lisa in my living room. The painting was a gift from the previous owners, so seeing him stare at it so intently was quite the scene to see. That's when I asked, "Hey, big fan of paintings, are you?" Yes, Mona Lisa is one beautiful woman, isn't she? Yeah. I'm the one who painted this. Oh, really now? Yes. I actually gave it to the owners before you came here as a welcome to the neighborhood gift. I suppose they passed the gift to you now, huh? Yeah, they did. Well, if you painted this, then you are very talented, sir. May I tell you something, Jack? Sure, man. I used to live in this house for decades, long before the previous owners did. I found Sebastian's statement a bit strange, seeing as he lived next door, so I said, "So why did you move from this house to next door?" Well, my daughter ran away from home not too long ago. However, I've always wanted a bigger living space. I figured if I stayed in the area, she might come back home one day. That's why I moved next door. It also has 2 extra rooms in this house, so yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that, sir. I hope she shows back one day. And I also moved out because the house might be haunted. What? I'm just kidding, Jack. Anyway, I'll see you around. Okay, see you later, Bash. As Sebastian heads out the front door, I couldn't help but feel a sense of paranoia from the whole haunted remark. And why the hell he would joke about such a sensitive topic regarding his daughter. Even though he said he was joking, I couldn't tell if he was bluffing or just trying to cover up the fact that the place was actually haunted. Nonetheless, I knew that when we inevitably crossed paths again, I would double down and address the bizarre remark. After about a week in the new house, I could honestly say that living there was swell, except my paranoia grew stronger as the days went by. I couldn't help but stutter every time I heard the floor creak or the wind howling from outside my window, as I attributed it to Sebastian's haunted remark. The employees at my workplace even noticed how drowsy I was every time I showed up to work. I had lost a considerable amount of sleep every day. I couldn't help but feel a little frustrated considering I hadn't seen Sebastian since the day I moved in. It was almost as if he had isolated himself in his house or had completely relocated somewhere else. It was hard to track his whereabouts as I didn't know if his vehicle was in his garage or not. This is when the story gets extremely disturbing. There was one night when I remember tossing and turning in my bed from the nonstop creaks and sounds coming from my house. I decided to get up from my bed and cautiously walk towards my bedroom door. I could hear subtle sounds coming from downstairs. It didn't sound like the typical creaking sounds I usually heard, just a subtle male voice mumbling some kind of gibberish. I made sure to tiptoe my way towards the top of the staircase. As I began making my way towards the bottom of the stairs, I attempted to not make any sounds with each gradual step I took. The mumbling sound began to intensify. Someone was definitely down there. I eventually make it halfway through the staircase and saw Sebastian standing in my living room facing the Mona Lisa painting. My first instinct was to yell, "Get the hell out of here, I'm calling the cops," but I didn't want to potentially compromise my life, so I remained crouched down with my hand over my mouth. I couldn't help but feel emotions of anger and disgust as I asked myself, why the hell is this guy in my house in the middle of the night? How the hell did he get inside? Was he the one causing the creaking sounds this whole time? Panic began rushing through my veins when I could make out some of the words he was saying. "You're in a better place now, baby girl. Daddy still loves you, okay? You were the best girl a father could ever ask for. I loved every single moment we shared. I hope you can forgive me for what I did. Just know, Daddy did what he had to do, so he wouldn't go to jail. See you in the next life, baby girl. Sleep tight." Sebastian then casually walks away as I hear him exit through the back door and lock it upon his exit. I knew he must have had a spare key to the house. I made sure to keep the lights off as I didn't want to give Sebastian any indication that I had awoken. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator then said,
911, what's your emergency?
"Someone just broke into my house. I think it's my neighbor."
Okay, sir, please remain on the line. We're sending a unit your way.
"Well, hurry up, he might come back."
Sir, can you please confirm your address?
That's when I placed my phone on the floor and approached one of my closets that held some outdoor equipment.
Sir, are you still there?
I grabbed an axe and a hard hat with a flashlight attached to it and began walking towards the Mona Lisa portrait. I put the hard hat on and turned on the flashlight attached to it. Now, I'm not sure what possessed me to do this, but the portrait fueled my anxiety to the point where I completely yanked it off the wall and tossed it into the corner. My speculations were accurate. There behind the painting lied a patched-up component to the wall. I could tell there must have been a hole previous to the patch, considering the color of it was different compared to the rest of the interior. That's when I raised my axe and began hacking at the wall like a maniac. At this point, all I could see was red. I completely obliterated the wall with every bad intention I had built up that night. The more destruction I caused, the more shocking secrets began unveiling themselves. There behind the wall, like the rotting corpse of a young girl. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was living with a dead corpse in my wall the whole time. Sirens from police cars began roaming the streets. Blue and red headlights flashed through my window and into my house. I rushed to my front door and began waving my arms profusely. After disclosing the details of the newly discovered corpse and the appearance of my neighbor in my house, the police began knocking repeatedly at his door as they couldn't barge in without a search warrant. About several minutes later, a loud bang could be heard within his house. It was later found out that Sebastian had pulled the gun on himself and completely blew his brains out. The corpse that was discovered in my house was indeed his daughter. Before I or any of the previous tenants had moved in, Sebastian had claimed that his daughter was a runaway. But the truth was, Sebastian had abused his daughter for years and eventually killed her. He hid her deceased body in the wall and patched it up before finally putting the house up for sale. Sebastian would use a famous portrait of Mona Lisa as a cover-up gift for new tenants. Some speculate that he moved next door because he wanted to further abuse the spirit of his daughter. I believe it was because the spirit of his daughter tormented him every night, the same way she did to me. I was a high school graduate that recently got hired for full-time work at KFC. We were the biggest chicken venue around town, as places like Popeyes weren't as big of a franchise at the time. Our hours of operations were usually 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., sometimes 12 p.m. for close if it was the weekend. The job came second nature to me. It was always clock in, clean up, fry the chicken, and of course assist any customers at the cashier. There was one memorable time when I was on my way to work and encountered a homeless man that literally dressed up as the Colonel. I was initially a little skeptical that he was homeless from his fancy attire, but from the rumors circulating from the other employees, he had recently started panhandling around the area for the past several weeks. As I made my way towards the front door, the Colonel raises his plastic cup at me and says,
"Me lad, spare an old fella some change?"
"Sir, I only make minimum wage."
"If it wasn't for me, KFC wouldn't exist, kid. At least spare me some leftover chicken during your lunch break, okay?"
"Get a job, old man." The first initial weeks of the job were swell, but things took a sudden turn for the worst. We had started running low on chicken, and my boss began to point the finger at me. He assumed I had been taking home chicken after my shift was done, but I assured him it wasn't me. This began happening on multiple occasions where large batches of chicken suddenly started disappearing. It had come to a point where my boss began to threaten my job. I pleaded with my boss to investigate the day shift employees, but it was impossible for them to be the culprits as he supervised them during that shift.
"Stop eating my chicken, kid!"
"Sir, it's not me. I bring my own lunch."
"If any more chicken goes missing in this kitchen, you're fired, you hear me?"
"Yes, sir." It was finally that time again. The night shift. Or should I say, my potential last shift at KFC. My pride and ego wouldn't allow me to accept the fact that I was being falsely accused, so I remained at the front counter, while occasionally looking behind my shoulder every 5 minutes or so. The time was roughly 11:50 p.m. on a Friday. I was just about to wrap up another successful shift until I heard a loud thud coming from the kitchen area. I began to cautiously walk to the back and saw no sign of anyone. No raccoons, no lurking intruders, just the standard kitchen appliances with the drive-through window securely locked in place. That's when I heard a sound coming from the stockroom where we kept all our inventory. I could hear the sound of vigorous chewing as I approached the door. I knew someone had to be in there eating all our fried chicken. Was this going to be the day I finally catch the culprit in the act? I placed my hand on the door handle and opened the door in one swift motion, unveiling the same colonel I had seen before, dousing his face with fried chicken. My suspicions were accurate. The reason for all the missing chicken stood there before me. How the hell did you get in here? Boy, I couldn't resist. Y'all make a big enough batch to feed the whole town, might I say. It was you. You were the one that was eating our chicken the whole time. How could I not? It's so finger-licking good. Ah! I slammed the door shut, making sure to lock it so I didn't have to get physical with the colonel. He then started violently punching the door with his bare fists as I stood back in awe, not knowing whether I should call the cops or run the hell out of there. Open the door, or I'm gonna show you a new meaning to finger-licking good, kid. Leave me alone before I call the cops! I sprinted towards the front counter while arming myself with a knife from the kitchen. I began dialing 911 while trying to explain to the operator the bizarre situation I was in. After a long 10 to 15 strenuous minutes, the police finally showed face. I began directing them to the stockroom where I had initially trapped the man. A group of armed policemen rammed their way through the door only to see no sign of the colonel. What we then discovered was that there was a panel on the ceiling that had been removed, thus allowing access for any culprit to enter and exit the building at their convenience. After further investigation, it was later found out through parking lot surveillance cameras that the colonel had been sneaking through the KFC building every night through the same panel on the roof leading to the stockroom. He had been eating our chicken for God knows how long. What makes the story more discomforting was how he would casually jump across the roof and into the KFC bucket sign, just so he could crawl inside and sleep there every night. All I know is that that man is mentally sick in the head and needs to seek some kind of professional help. Tell me, is it finger-licking good?